Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guests today are Allison Garland, who is project director for the Wilson Center's Urban Sustainability Laboratory, and Blair Ruble, a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center, who previously served as vice president for programs and as director of the center's Comparative Urban Studies Program and Urban Sustainability Laboratory. Allison, Blair, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I want to give our viewers a little pull back the curtain behind the scenes of how some of these programs come to be. And, I was watching with interest the advertising around the New York mayoral race. And the whole presentation from an interest group was, who has the answers that will help the city recover post-pandemic? And that was the litmus test they were throwing out there for any candidate who wanted to be the next mayor of New York. And right away, I thought of both of you, and I thought of having this discussion about what is happening in the pandemic world to cities and to urbanization, and what we could look forward to as the pandemic begins to subside, at least in some regions of the world. So that's how we came together today. And I want to ask both of you, has this been something that's been on your mind in a similar way? Allison, can we begin with you?
Sure, it's very much been on my mind. And I guess in thinking about our conversation today, like you said, I just wanted to first acknowledge that the situation in US cities is very different from other cities in the rest of the world. And we're just in a very different place right now. We're thinking about the post-pandemic future and the post-pandemic city. While many in the US are thinking about returning to the office, that's going to have a tremendous impact on how the future of cities and what that's going to look like. And whether we're thinking about a phased return or a hybrid return, the US is very much focusing right now on recovery and planning for this new normal. Where other parts of the world are still really in this kind of an emergency reaction phase. And we're still waiting to learn what the health and economic toll is going to be, which will really shape what the future of global cities is going to be. But as we get into our conversation, I did kind of think about some universal ideas that are going to shape the post-pandemic city.
Great. Well, look forward to hearing those as we dig in. But Blair, first, get your general thoughts. I know you're someone who thinks about this both technically and philosophically. What has happened to urbanization in the shadow of the pandemic? Do you see this as a bump in the road or a sea change?
Well, I think we're headed towards a sea change, but the pandemic may be the bump in the road leading up to the sea change brought about by climate change. I think Allison is very much on point when she says that how we think about U.S. cities really is different from what's going on elsewhere in the world, and we need to be a little bit careful of extrapolating from the American experience to everywhere, because there are patterns baked in the American urban system which are different, dependency on cars and so on and so forth. But I think there are a couple of issues that have emerged to the fore right away, which will be sorted out in some manner or other in the immediate term. They have to do with the clear inequality of cities, the differential impact of dramatic social, economic, climate forces on different populations in cities are not the same. I think it's also clear that there are some kinds of primarily professional services where maybe the office footprint of the past is much larger than it will be in the future as more and more people work from home. But we've also seen that there's a whole range of economic activities that very much depend on people being present. So to simply say, most lawyers in New York are going to live in upstate New York and come in one day a week. That may be true, but there are literally hundreds of thousands of other people in New York who won't be able to do that. So we need to think about all of these factors as we think about moving forward.
Both of you have made a distinction between US cities and cities in other places around the globe. Can you unpack that a bit in terms of, are we talking about, are the differences largely between developed nations and less developed nations? Or are there huge cultural differences that come into play? And relatively speaking, are US cities consequently at an advantage or disadvantage when compared to other major cities around the world, whether it be Moscow or London or Mexico City or wherever it might be?
Yeah, I think that, I think I was really differentiating between developed world cities and developing world cities. I think that we have to be, when we're talking about developing world cities with 1 billion people living in slums where there's overcrowding and inadequate housing and no access to water and sanitation and electricity, talking about recovery is a very different discussion than when we're talking about cities in the US.
Also among developed cities, according to some estimates for by mid-century, if we're going to have a chance of somehow finding a sustainable economic balance, 70% of all movement in cities will have to be either electric or human driven, bicycles, walking, and rely on transit. And other cities in Europe and in Asia are better situated to make that transition already. In many even less developed Asian cities, you have a heavy reliance already on electronic scooters and electronic forms of transportation. So the US has a very special transition it needs to make. And it would be very difficult and challenging in any event. But I think you add on the layer of the uncertainties coming out of the pandemic, and it's not at all clear what the pattern needs to be.
Blair, those advantages that you say other cities have, are those cultural, where people are just more used to using bicycles or whatever it might be, or are they infrastructure where they created cities that accommodate those types of vehicles?
Well, at some point it becomes cultural, perhaps, but basically there's been investment in infrastructure. There's been investment in public transit. Chinese cities, they've created a national high-speed rail network. China is actually about the same size as continental US, so this notion of distance not requiring high-speed rail kind of begins to fade into the background. They've built tremendous metro systems, and these were built for many different reasons, and they had a certain advantage in that the auto revolution hadn't gone as far as it had, say, in Europe and the United States. But the point is that there's a different lifestyle. Even a wealthy city like Tokyo, transit ridership is far beyond anything we see here. So in a situation where electronic transit becomes important for survival because of climate, there's a certain advantage. And at a certain point, it does become baked into what you're referring to as culture, but it really begins with an investment in infrastructure that we've deferred for a very long time.
Allison, I wonder how close we might be to some seismic change in the way we move around within a city. So, not to make this about me in any way, but just as an example, I was in New York City a couple of weeks ago. I drove a car from Port Chester, New York to Greenwich Village in Lower Manhattan. And it took me about, with no traffic on that side of the commute, about 20 minutes. The same trip on the return, 2.5 hours, covering the same distance, with all kinds of traffic around LaGuardia, things of that nature. And as you're sitting in it, you just wonder, how crazy is this and how sustainable is this? And how close are we to a scenario where, you leave your car at the border and when you're in the city, there are no cars?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's sort of perhaps a positive outcome is, or at least an opportunity, is this pandemic really has led people to rethink the form and function of cities. And there's been a lot of experimentation. People were desperate to get outside. So we saw these car-free streets. We saw slow streets. We saw bus lanes for essential workers, dedicated bus lanes. These are things that were in the works, but were really accelerated by the pandemic and have proven to be very popular. We have streeteries. We're really taking back our streets that are really like a huge, great public space that we've just traditionally given over to cars. And now there's been a complete rethinking of that. And some of these experimental pilot programs have been really popular in cities across the US and also globally. And I think they're going to stick. I think they're going to spread and stick. I think that in Paris, the 15-minute city, the concept, it gets a lot of debate, but the idea that you should be able to reach everything you need within a 15-minute walk or bike ride from where you live. And now I think those ideas are really gaining traction. They're more mainstream. These like complete neighborhoods in Portland are being accelerated. So I think that these are changes that we're seeing that were trials during the pandemic out of necessity, and now they've become very popular, and I think they're going to stay.
Necessity as mother of invention, and both of you have alluded to the fact that perhaps the way we should be framing this is that the pandemic isn't the game changer, it's just an accelerant, and that the changes were underway already.
And I think, John, going back to your example of the 20-minute drive in from Portchester and the 2.5-hour drive back out, I think that there are people who have actually gotten used to driving around the Washington, D.C. metro area with less traffic. And I've talked to many people who say, well, gee, why should I ever get on metro again? It's so easy to drive. But of course, depending on how we go back to offices, it may have been a 20-minute drive during the pandemic, but when we get back to something approximate to normal, it may again be 2 hours. And I think there's just going to be a lot of learning and sorting out about how people want to go about doing things. I also think, and this gets into the ways we'll be using offices differently. I think cities, Austin is a good example, and DC, if you leave out the very downtown core, is another example of this. Cities that have invested in trying to have residential areas integrated into their downtowns are going to have an easier time of coming back because they're less totally dependent on office space. And I think that's going to be another pattern that we see. And if we move away from standardized office hours in some form, transit authorities are going to have to adjust because there'll be perhaps more movement during so-called off-peak periods, while rush hours may be a little bit less crowded. So I think there's a lot of adjustment that it's very difficult to say now what's going to happen, but it will take place.
In a world and nation that can't agree on much, I'm guessing we could all agree that if we never see rush hour in its old form again, we'd all be happy about that brave new world. Along the lines of what you were just describing, Blair, I'm going to ask both of you if you could come up with a list. Are there countries around the world who are best positioned for a variety of reasons to be frontrunners in this reimagining of what a city is and can be?
Yeah, I think, as Blair mentioned earlier, a lot of the Asian cities have made tremendous investments in infrastructure, in urban infrastructure. So they're well positioned, as far as high-speed rail and more, forward-looking urbanism. And then if you look at European cities, there's been a huge interest in decarbonizing cities and making carbon-free cities, car-free cities. So I think there are models around the world of moving forward that the U.S. could take a lesson from.
Yeah, I think Asian cities are an obvious example, but looking to Europe, Copenhagen has been a leader all along in making these adjustments, and it appears that they will continue to do so. But even a city like Berlin, where they're experimenting, pretty soon they're going to have driverless taxis on the street, electronic driverless taxis on the street. We see a lot of experimentation taking place, and I think there has been I think in general in Europe, there's been a coming to terms with the climate issues a little bit more seriously. So the pandemic creates the moment when a lot of changes that probably would come about anyway are being pushed forward, an accelerant, as you put it. But going back to one other issue, which we've mentioned, but we haven't dwelt on, the whole issue of inequality is going to really drive outcomes. And one of the real challenges we have in this country is the uneven landscape in healthcare and economic opportunity and education, and something as basic as broadband accessibility. And it's not just within a metropolitan region. We have rural areas that are really being left behind as well. And we need to think a lot about how we connect all of this together in new ways, or we will be left behind.
Allison, you earlier teased out that you'd put together a list of ideas. This might be a good time to have you share those with us.
Sure. I was just, Blair has already mentioned inequality a few times, and I think that is really the most important issue. And the UN Secretary General gave a speech about COVID last year, and he said COVID is like an X-ray that reveals all of the fractures in society, and that it has exposed these systemic inequalities around the world. And this pandemic is demanding attention to those inequalities. And I thought that was a really good way of looking at it and understanding it, because unless that's addressed, the recovery will be uneven. I mean, we hear a lot about the K-shaped recovery, but I think inequality is the most important issue, because we know that disaster disproportionately impacts the poor, and we know that and minorities, and we also know that recovery takes much longer for minorities and the poor. So that was the first and foremost thing that I think we needed to talk about. The other thing that I wanted to just emphasize is that I think that cities are part of the solution, and that cities will play a key role in the recovery. Our work in the Urban Lab, what we try to do is really present cities as solutions and not as problems. And cities can be drivers for inclusive and sustainable development. And we see cities as the engines of economic growth, that they produce 80% of global GDP. More than half of the world lives in cities, and we expect that number to grow increasingly over the next years. So I think any response to the pandemic would be most effective taking place as an urban response in cities. The other thing that we haven't really talked about yet that I think is really important is housing. I think that we now realize housing is key to public health, and housing is going to be at the center of any recovery. That we haven't really talked about the eviction crisis. That is something that's occurring in the US and in the rest of the world. Our moratorium on evictions and on foreclosures the federal moratorium is lifting at the end of this month on July 31st. There are a lot of local protections against eviction and rent increases that are being phased out by cities over the next month. And state and local governments are racing to distribute rental assistance that came with the American Rescue Plan. So I think that's something that we really have to pay attention to. There are more than 6 million people in America behind on rent at risk of eviction. And I think affordable housing and homelessness, those were major policy challenges before the pandemic. And so now, again, that it's just being highlighted as an issue that really can't be ignored further. And we need to make these longer term investments in affordable housing.
Blair, what thoughts would you add on this question of housing? And are there ideas out there to address what is a looming crisis?
Well, I think the housing crisis, I think what the pandemic has shown is the housing crisis is here. And of course, if you read about, in many parts of the US, housing prices are skyrocketing more quickly than before. And not just in cities. This and that's another thing about a lot of this. We need to think about metropolitan regions, not just as Americans tend to do. Think of cities as the central, central city. But you know, the challenge is it's very difficult, if not impossible, to build affordable housing without some kind of subsidy. It's just too expensive to do it, and the private sector can't afford to do it. And then you get into a situation, well, what should the subsidy be? And how should the subsidy be administered? And should it be housing vouchers, which allow people below a certain income an opportunity to look at sort of move up a notch or two in their search for housing? Is it giving subsidies to developers to make up the difference in cost? We don't really have a good sense of that. One of the biggest subsidies historically in this country was the mortgage tax write-off deduction. And we didn't think about that as a subsidy, but it was probably the biggest subsidy in American history. And that really did allow some people who otherwise would have been priced out of the housing market to move back in. So we really need to give a lot of thought to how you take the construction of suitable housing, and which will be more expensive than many groups in society can afford, and make it affordable, and where and how do you intervene in the process to make it more equitable. But if we don't, we will pay the price one way or another. And then the other point to make is I think there really has to be serious investment and new thinking about homelessness, which we see in every city in this country. It was there before, but it's no longer hidden. You can't sweep it under the rug.
You know, Blair, in just about 30 or 40 seconds, when you were unraveling the various layers of the onion around housing, it was a lesson in complexity, where what starts as a straightforward issue, suddenly we're 7, 8 layers deep, and the level of complexity, and therefore the level of difficulty in solving the problem, increases and increases. With that in mind, I want to ask both of you, in addition to yourselves and the Urban Sustainability Laboratory, where is the thought leadership around cities and urbanization? Are there individuals or organizations globally or in the US that you can point interested people to who are leading the charge in at least the ideas industry? Public policy is a whole other issue, and there may be leaders there as well. But I'm wondering who or what you might identify in that regard.
Well, I think there are a number of university-based centers that are thought leaders: University of Pennsylvania, NYU, Berkeley. I mean, they're traditional places to look for new ideas, and they are producing them. There's a long list there. I think that there are also some international organizations that have been engaged a long time. I think of Cities Alliance. I also think of some of the development banks. The Asian Development Bank has just actually released a major report on Asian cities coming out of the pandemic that's full of new ideas. And so I think the ideas are out there if you kind of look for them. The one point I would make, though, is, John, you mentioned the complexity. People who actually think they have a silver bullet in response to these issues are probably people you shouldn't be listening to, because it's just too complicated for any one approach.
Yeah.
Allison, any final thoughts?
Sure. I would just add to Blair's list, UN Habitat which is the arm of the UN devoted to human settlements. And they were really instrumental in seeing an urban sustainable development goal. So there is a global goal devoted to cities, to making cities more safe, inclusive, and resilient. And that really was the work of UN Habitat to ensure that that happened. And they have developed a document called the New Urban Agenda. That's a roadmap for implementing the urban sustainability goal. So I do think there's a lot of work being done on urban issues out there. And I think globally there is that commitment to cities. And that's really what we try to do here at the Urban Lab, is really give some of that work a voice and a platform.
Well, thanks. I want to thank both of you for what has been a thought-provoking and thoughtful discussion. And I'll second your plug there, Allison, for people more interested in the topic. Come to wilsoncenter.org, check out the Urban Sustainability Laboratory. It will give you an entree into this whole world and these two very thoughtful experts. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, John.
And to our viewers, thank you. Hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.